Good morning and welcome to the Scoring Wizard training. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Karen Wilbright and I work on the business operations team at Minnesota Housing. The training today will focus on the system you will use to apply for funding and complete the self-scoring process for the 2022 Consolidated RFP and the 2023 Housing Tax Credit Round 1. For an in-depth look at the scoring content and supporting documentation requirements, be sure to register for one of our self-scoring worksheet trainings offered in May. You can find registration information on the application resources page on our website. Minnesota Housing provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. Minnesota Housing offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and to stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. It also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. It has pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the most vulnerable citizens. A few housekeeping items before we dive into the training content today. We'll have time at the end of the session for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please click the raise your hand button in the GoToWebinar toolbar so that we can call on you and unmute your line. You can also enter questions directly under the questions tab and feel free to drop questions in that box at any time during the training. As a reminder, technical assistance is intended to be helpful, but it doesn't modify or override any of our requirements in Minnesota Housing's Qualified Allocation Plan, Self-Scoring Worksheet, application instructions, underwriting standards, and other documents related to the application. Now that we have those housekeeping items out of the way, today's training will include an overview of what's new in the Multifamily Customer Portal, commonly referred to as the portal. We will then shift to a live demonstration that briefly walks you through the steps to start your project in the system, manage your checklist. We'll spend a bulk of the demo reviewing how to create and submit a score sheet using the scoring wizard. And at the end of the training, I'll provide some reminders to avoid common mistakes and open it up for questions. Each year, we send out a survey after the completion of the consolidated RFP to gather feedback about our processes, systems, and tools. Based on your feedback, we recently rolled out several changes in the portal, and I'll highlight those today. One of the new features is when you create a new project, you'll now receive an email confirmation. We also added an email confirmation when the final score sheet is submitted. This supplements the previous confirmation that was on screen. And we've added some functionality behind the scenes to validate when that confirmation goes out, whether or not you've completed both your application checklist and submitted your final score sheet, or if you've completed one or the other. The email notification will let you know what's still remaining, or if you've completed both, it will tell you that you're done. For those that create a project prior to the intent to apply deadline, but decide not to move forward with the submission of a full application, we added a withdraw button to allow users to withdraw your project from the system. The button is located on the project page near the scoring wizard button, and I'll point this out during the live demonstration. If you click on the withdraw project button, you'll be prompted to confirm before the status changes to withdrawn. A couple of other minor changes that we made is we added a new number of buildings field when you create a project using the apply for funding wizard, and we added a phone number field on project team access request form. So what's new in the scoring wizard specifically? Minnesota Housing rolled out the scoring wizard last year to replace an Excel-based self-scoring worksheet. We recognize anytime we introduce a new tool, it takes some time to work out the kinks, and we thank you for your patience and willingness to share feedback and how we can make improvements. Some of the feedback that we've received through this survey or through emails we'll address when we roll out the scoring wizard for the next 2-year qualified allocation plan, but I'll highlight changes that we were able to make this year. We added some additional on-screen guidance to clarify the definition of total units and total assisted units. As you can see on the screen, it's listed right underneath the assisted units by size header. Under access to transit, we made the point options dynamic based on the project's location so that you can only select point options for which you're eligible for. For example, if you're in Greater Minnesota, you'll only see the point options available for projects within that area. We also added an option for customers to elect fewer points than they're eligible for categories such as financial readiness, other contributions, and intermediary costs. We heard from some applicants last year that while intermediary costs, for example, identified in the multifamily workbook show they're eligible for 6 points, they would like to be able to select a tier below that in order to allow some cushion for cost increases. I'll walk you through during the demonstration on how you can select fewer points. So now I'm going to go ahead and switch us over to the system and do an actual live portal demonstration. So 1 second. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and log into our system, and I'm also going to turn off my camera at this point, and I'll turn it back on later on in the presentation. A few things to note before I log in. If you don't yet have a portal account, please be sure to request that soon. The earlier the better, so that we can process that request prior to any upcoming deadlines. So I'm going to hit login, and the first thing that will happen is I'll land on the home page. And when you are going to apply for funding, you will click on funding rounds, which will show you the open funding rounds that are currently accepting applications. For this funding round, I'll click on the 2022 RFP. And on this new page, you'll see some high-level detail about the funding round, including the date that it closes. To start my project, I'm going to click the Apply for Funding button. And this will launch our Apply for Funding wizard, which asks you questions about your project. You'll see that once we get to the scoring wizard, much of the functionality in this Apply for Funding wizard is similar to the functionality that you'll see in the scoring wizard as well. So for this demo, I'm going to go ahead and create a test project. And I'm going to answer questions as I go. For example, I will say that it's a dual application and select my proposal type. In this case, I'm going to say it's a tax credit only as my primary, and a deferred loan with 4% tax credits as the secondary. I'll enter in some data. And I'll put in, some of this will just be test data. If you need to look up your latitude and longitude for the project, you can click the Community Profiles map link on the screen. So next, I'm going to click Next, and here I'll be guided through Project Snapshot at Application. So these fields, something to be aware of is that we ask for you to provide as much context as you can when you're setting up your project, but you can edit these particular fields at any time after you've created the project. And I'll show you where you can do that once we finish creating it. I'm going to say yes, no. Another thing to keep in mind is that depending on what value you select in some of these questions, additional questions may pop up. So for example, I said, yes, there is development and construction costs, and now I'll enter some of those costs. We do require you to also identify your project sponsor, developer, and processing agent if you have them included in your project. And for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to click no for these other roles just so that we can proceed ahead. But I anticipate most of you will have a developer, and if some projects will also have a processing agent. Before I actually create my project, I will land on the Review and Create Project tab where I can review all of the data that was entered. If for whatever reason I need to go back and change something, at the top I can click on the path in order to take me directly to that area to make modifications. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Project. Next, I will see a item that tells me that my project has been successfully created, and I can either request to add team members now, or I can go to my project and begin working on it. For this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and just show you how you could add team members. So click Add Team Members. It will give you some information about what giving team member access means, and then I'm going to click Add Team Member. Here's where I'd actually identify who I'd like added. So for example, if you're a processing agent creating a project on behalf of a customer, you could identify the customer's name, or vice versa. If you're the customer and we have a processing agent, you could add them as well. For this demonstration, I'll just put in some test information. And you can add as many as you'd like. And I'm going to cancel out. So you can see I now have one person that I've added. I can add additional. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and finish and go to my project. So now I've actually created my project. So the next time I log in, if I wanted to access this one, I could go to the Projects tab and it will appear in my list of available projects. A couple of things to note, as I mentioned, during the project setup, you can enter information about what your application will look like. Under the Details tab, under this Project Snapshot Application section is where you could go and modify some of these fields. If, for example, your construction costs change or you determine that you want to use a different proposal type. The second piece of setting up your project that is required in order to meet our intent to apply deadline is for you to go and identify your project characteristics. To do that, you'll click on the Characteristics tab, and you'll see a list of all of the available characteristics, and you're able to also see a description. If for whatever reason the description is truncated, you can click on the little down arrow and click Wrap Text, and then it will show you a full description. A couple of things to keep in mind. If you're submitting a dual application, meaning you're coming in under multiple financing structures, when you're selecting proposal type, you'll want to select two of them. So in this case, I'm doing a 9% housing tax credit only project and a deferred with 4% housing tax credits. I'm going to say that I have supportive housing, new construction. I want to make sure that I indicate I have a dual application. And in this case, I'm going to say I also have a first mortgage request and Section 811. So I can go ahead, click all of the items that I want, and then click Add. Now you can see over on the right side that all of my selected characteristics have been added. And what this does is it actually adds checklist items to your checklists. You can come and modify these characteristics at any time, or if you wanted to see sort of what adding a specific characteristic does to your checklist. You can go ahead and add them and then remove them later if you determine that you don't want that. So now I'm going to quickly click on checklists and point out a couple of things. So you'll see that we have 3 checklists available at this time. 2 of them are pre-applications, but the majority of you will work on the application checklist. So I'm going to click View Application Checklist. And I just want to point out a couple of things before we move to the scoring wizard. In the left-hand side, you can see I have the ability to filter, including by my characteristics, upload status, kind of thing. I also have a search feature that's within the checklist itself. So say I wanted to look for a specific item like other contributions, I can do a search and it will pull those up. If I click on a specific checklist item, in this case, we'll click on Community Development Initiative. It will pull up an area where I can upload the files, including using drag or drop. I'll be able to see some high-level detail about what is required for that checklist item, including whether or not it's optional. I can click that I want to opt out of it on this page. And then if there is a required file extension, which is typical for our multifamily workbook and a few other Excel-based files, it will let me know that here. At the bottom, there's help text available, and oftentimes there will also be some related links if there's additional forms that you might want to see. Or there's a link available in our quick links if there's a resource guide or template. I'm going to return to my checklist by going to View Application Checklist, and then I'm going to return to my project. So now I'm going to move into actually launching the scoring wizard. Before I do, I wanted to point out near the scoring wizard button, there is the withdraw project button. So this is again available if you determine that you create your project in the system, but ultimately you decide you're not going to move forward with your application. You can click this in order to communicate to us that you no longer want to proceed. You can also, as I mentioned earlier, at any time add additional people to your project. If you decide, I need to add a new staff person or someone else, you can put in a request by going to this project access request, clicking new, and it will walk you through some of the same fields that you saw earlier when we were actually setting up the project. I am going to go ahead and launch the scoring wizard. When you pull up the scoring wizard for the first time on a project, you'll be prompted to accept our terms and conditions, and you must accept them in order to proceed. You'll also be prompted to let us know if you are creating a test scenario or a final version of the score sheet. Our system allows you to create up to 4 total versions, including 3 test scenarios and 1 final. In this case, I'm going to click test scenario to show you how that works. You'll also notice that there is a toggle feature at the top of the page on the scoring wizard that allows you to see some additional information. Okay, a few things to point out now that we're in the scoring wizard. So similar to that apply for funding wizard, you see there's a visual path at the top. Once I've gone through the tabs and completed required fields, it will allow me to jump from section to section by clicking on the header in this path. We've also added links to a couple of core documents that we'd like you to review and have access to while you're completing the scoring wizard. So, for example, we have access to the self-scoring worksheet that has the detailed language that was included in our qualified allocation plan. We have access to the scoring guide, and this includes information about where to save scoring backup documentation. And we also have a link to the self-scoring, the Scoring Wizard user guide. Okay, so as you go, it will ask you questions and it will save as you go as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and start the Scoring Wizard and I'll point out a few things as we go. So in this case, I'm gonna say it's my 9% HTC application. When it asks you to briefly describe the scenario, it's really just so if you're creating multiple score sheets for a given project, you can differentiate between them. So say you wanted to do, one test with people with disabilities units and another without, you're able to differentiate between those two. Let's say I'm in suburban, no scattered sites, and now I'm going to enter the total units. Again, here is where we added some of that additional language this year based on staff or based on customer feedback. Enter in, I'll say I have 35 units. So one thing to keep in mind is that total units and assisted units are used in a number of places to calculate the number of points that you may be eligible for. So if you need to come back and change these for whatever reason, we recommend that you review some of the other scoring categories that you had already filled out, just to make sure that you've reflected that change in multiple places. The system will flag if it sees any sort of error at the end before you actually submit, but best practice is if you make a big change to the number of units is that you go and review comprehensively. I'm going to hit save and next. And here's where I'll enter in assisted units. And for this scenario, I'm going to say that we have the same number of assisted units. I did also want to note that the system will flag if you have put in a maximum number. So there's verification and error messages that will populate depending on information that you put in. And so in this case, I know that I have a maximum of 5 two-bedroom units. So I'll have to correct that. So now I'm going to go ahead and just click random questions. And depending on what I select, some of the questions will either hide or display. So for example, if I were to click this one, it will prompt me to do different things. Let's see. In a number of the grids, you'll notice that it will calculate percentages for you off to the side. And here's another good example of, depending on what I select, some of the questions will hide. So if I said I'm not applying for tax credits, quite a few of the questions disappeared. If I'm saying, yes, I am applying for tax credits, they'll come back. I'm going to continue just to answer questions as needed. And so, for example, here I said my project meets people with disabilities threshold and that I did submit a Section 811 pre-app, but I was ineligible. And now I'd enter the number of units for people with disabilities not using Section 811. So I'll say there's 5 in this case. So I'll say that I have some rental assistance. True. Okay, geographic choice, I wanted to just flag this as there is a checklist item called geographic choice hold harmless provisions. where if you decide that you want to use the data from last year's RFP, if you meet the requirements identified in our methodologies, you can upload documentation that indicates you're using the data from last year. Otherwise, I'm going to just go ahead and click the point options. We also link to our community profiles on the screen, and we also link to Walk Score. Okay, so here, similar to last year, you're going to enter in the amount of funding that you have committed, other contributions, intermediary costs, and we recommend that the values on this page match what you put in the workbook. But if you do decide that you want to elect fewer points than you're eligible for, you can do that on the Claim Points tab, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay. Just to make sure that we have a right test scenario, I'll do this. Okay, save and next. Okay, so now I've gone through and I've actually answered a number of the questions, and I'm on the Claim Points tab. So this particular tab is important to validate that any points that you're eligible for, you would want to look through and make sure you actually claim them. It is set up this year to default to select all of the points that you're eligible for. So you can see at the top, it says total points claimed 105 and total points available to claim 105. If I wanted to not claim a specific category, even if I'm eligible for them, what I would do is I click the plus icon next to the category, and you'll see now I have more detailed sections available to choose from that correspond to questions throughout the wizard. So for example, in this case, it says that I'm eligible for 12 points under the large family housing. If for whatever reason I didn't want to actually get points for large family housing, I would click this little toggle button, and you can see now it's turned off and it shows 0 points claimed. If I wanted to add the points back, I can go ahead and toggle it back on. Okay. As I move through, one of the categories I wanted to point out is under efficient use of scarce resources and leverage. So this is where we are able to actually opt to claim fewer points than you're eligible for. So you can see in this scenario, under financial readiness to proceed, it is currently claiming 16 points. If I wanted to claim fewer, what I would do is click the drop down and I would select the lower point value that I'm interested in claiming. And that would update then the claimed points that is reflected in here. Another thing I wanted to point out is that on these cards, you can see that there's some language that says data used, total development costs, and capital funding, or data used, total development costs, and other contributions. This is letting you know which of the questions in the scoring wizard are being referenced in order to determine whether or not there's eligible points that you could claim.
So if you have a question about why am I only seeing 2 points available under other contributions when you're anticipating that you'd get more points than that, I suggest that you review the sections about total development costs and other contributions to validate that you've entered data that you'd expect into those spaces. Once you've gone through and either claimed or unclaimed any of the points that you would like to actually include in your self-scoring worksheet, you can click Save and Review. This will bring you to a tab that shows you a summary report that lists out all of the data that you have entered into the scoring wizard, as well as the actual points that you will be eligible for. So at the top, you can see that it's showing the different questions and responses. And then as I move down, it will show me the point summary, including what are the maximum points, what are the available points, and what are the points that I have claimed. And one thing to note in here, you can say, so for example, for that financial readiness to proceed category, where it told me that I was actually eligible for 16 points, but I only opted to claim 12, it's reflected here. I can also click Print PDF if I wanted to generate this into a PDF for my records or to share with a Minnesota Housing staffer before technical assistance, for example. Now, one thing I wanted to point out on this page is you can see right now I don't have a button that says Verify and Submit. And there's a note here at the bottom that tells me that's because this particular score sheet is saved as a test scenario. Now, what I can do if I decide that I want to use this as my final version is I can actually go back to the scoring setup tab. It will toggle me back to that area, and I can decide to switch from the test scenario to final version. So that's one option to address this. The other option you have is, say you want to leave this test scenario as is. What you can do is you can save and close. And say you're coming back later, you want to come in and create either another test scenario or you want to create a new final version. You relaunch the scoring wizard. And I can do a couple of things. So I could start out with another final version, or I could select an existing score sheet and I could make an exact copy of it if I wanted to make maybe minor modifications to my test scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and do that in this case. I'm going to select Clone Selected Score Sheet. And it's now going to open up a copy. So in this case, what I'm going to decide to do is have this be my final version. And I'm going to mark it as final version on this page. Best practice is to go through the wizard just to validate that, yes, you have everything that you expected to claim has been claimed. You could also review the items comprehensively on the Claims Points tab. One thing to be aware of if you do clone a test score sheet is that you will need to go through this claim page again and say you decided you wanted to take fewer points than you're eligible for under the efficient use of scarce resources and leverage categories. You would have to go back and do that again and select those options on this new score sheet. Save and review. See the PDF. So now you can see what's different about this particular score sheet is I actually have a verify and submit button. And that is because we've marked it as a final version. So I'm going to go ahead and click verify and submit. And what it will do is it will run some validation in the background and it will check to see if there's any errors, if I've missed any required questions, if I've answered in a way that violates some of the dependencies that are required in our scoring wizard. And then it will identify the itemized lists that I need to go and change. If you wanted to sort of pause before you actually submit your score sheet, you can go ahead and click Not Yet, Return to Scoring Summary. Otherwise, you can click Yes, Submit Score Sheet. So I am going to go ahead and click Yes, Submit Score Sheet. And on the screen, you'll see I have successfully submitted my score sheet and click Finish. If I were to navigate to my email, I should also receive an email notification that says I have submitted the score sheet. But in the body of the email, it will tell me that I still have an application checklist that's open. Once both the application checklist are submitted and the final score sheet is submitted, I'll get an email confirmation that tells you that both are done. If I wanted to go back and view the scoring wizard or what I submitted, what I can do is click on the scoring wizard button again, and it will launch the screen that shows you both the final version as well as the test version. So you can see that I have that there. If I wanted to go and look at the final version, I'd click on the item and I'd open the score sheet. And it will bring me to the PDF, and I can print that PDF. Otherwise, I'm going to go and choose a different score sheet. If for whatever reason I wanted to go and play with a test scenario, even though I've already submitted, I can do that. I can open one that I've created and am able to play with that. I would not be able to submit a second final version. So keep in mind that if for whatever reason you submit a score sheet and you realize, I made an error, I need to make a change, you can contact mhfa.app at state.mn.us prior to the deadline, and we are able to unlock your score sheet. You will be required to resubmit your score sheet if you needed to make modifications in order to have met the official deadline. A couple of reminders, and some of these I already mentioned. You can use the data use language on the claims points tab to identify which grid or questions that are being used in order to calculate the points that you're able to claim. You can also switch from that test version of a score sheet to a final version, or switch a final version to a test if you need to. And you need to make sure that you submit your final score sheet before the deadline. If you need to make modifications, you can contact us. The other reminder I wanted to throw out there is that we have resources available for our customer portal on our website, as well as there's that self-scoring worksheet training coming up. There's actually 2 options in May that are available for customers that will go into more of the scoring content with our tax credit team and programs team.